Hi there. So my name is Elizabeth Larte, and I'm the Research Intelligence and Assessment Coordinator at the Alliance, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this session today. So today we'll be reviewing cross-sectional mapping of Canadian institutions' research data management strategies. I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I am working from Hamilton, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to care and share for the resources around the Great Lakes. A little known fact, Hamilton is home to over 150 waterfalls. This is one of them I took a picture of on the left, and it is a reminder to me of how this place has long served as a home, a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. As we proceed with our session today, it is with acknowledgement of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nations and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research, and of the data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. On behalf of the Digital Research Alliance Canada, we commit to understanding and taking up our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. So how did we get here? So in 2023, discussions began around examining what was included in various strategies, which led to University of Ottawa Heart Institute expressing interest in conducting a similar analysis. So this resulted in a collaboration between RAIG Alliance, University of Ottawa, and the Tri-Agencies to map these strategies over the course of 2023 and 2024. The collaboration yielded several knowledge products, including a comprehensive paper and presentations at several conferences. We're excited to continue with the knowledge sharing cycle and share the results of the mapping with the community. Today's session will include a presentation by our speakers and followed by a brief discussion period. So today we are joined by Dominic Roche, Chantal Rip, and Alexandra Cooper. Dom Roche is a senior policy advisor at Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dom has a background in environmental science and meta research on open science practices, specifically on data sharing. His work on transparency, reproducibility, and research integrity has led to more than 30 articles in peer-reviewed journals. In 2021, he co-founded the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, a learning society promoting open science practices in ecology and evolution and related disciplines. At SSHRC, Dom chairs the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Working Group and leads the implementation of the data deposit requirement for the three agencies. Dom will be providing an overview of the Tri-Agency's requirement this afternoon. Chantal Rip is a doctoral student in the Digital Transformation and Innovations Program and a research librarian at the University of Ottawa. Her research interests examine how research collaboration patterns influence how authors affiliated with federal science-based departments and agencies follow the Canadian government's roadmap for open science in open access publishing and open research data. Chantal was a member of the university's Research Data Management Advisory Group that led to the development of the institutional strategies published in 2023. She brings a wealth of experience in terms of teaching, scholarship, and research support, including stakeholder engagement, policy development, open access scholarship, knowledge mobilization, and RDM. Chantal will be providing results from the content analysis this afternoon. And finally, Alexandra Cooper is a data services coordinator at Queen's University, providing data and research data management support to researchers, faculty, staff, and students. She also contributes to a number of Canadian collaborative efforts, including the Ontario Council of University Libraries Ontario Data Community, Statistics Canada Data Liberation Initiative's Professional Development Committee, Borealis, the Canadian Dataverse Repository, Support Communities, and the Digital Research Alliance of Canada as a member of the Research Intelligence Expert Group. Alexandra has a BA in Religion and Culture at Canadian History. Alexandra will be providing results from the analysis of definitions and sources that were used in the strategies. Now over to our speakers. Thank you.
So as the first speaker, I was tasked with providing some context for the study that we're going to be discussing today, mapping institutional RDM strategies. And I'm very pleased to do that as an employee of SSHRC, as Liz mentioned, and also as a representative of the tri-agencies. So as many of you know, the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy was launched in March of 2021 with the objective of supporting Canadian research excellence by promoting sound research data management and data stewardship practices. And put another way, the policy aims to socialize and to incentivize research data management and sharing within the research community, and eventually have these activities become standard practices in research. So the policy is being implemented in the context of global changes in the policy landscape of major funding agencies in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere, as well as also a big push by international government organizations to modernize how scientific data are managed, stewarded, safeguarded, and shared. It's also being implemented in the context of Canada's national and international commitments to promoting and supporting open science practices, including research data management and sharing. So if you see the RDMS, the S at the end of RDM there is there to represent sharing. So these commitments made by Canada include, for example, the Chief Science Advisor's Roadmap for Open Science, published in 2020, and the 2023 communique of the G7 Science and Technology Ministers, which supports disseminating publicly funded research outputs in line with the FAIR principles that you probably know very well. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Another key commitment that the agencies have made was by signing the San Francisco DORA Declaration on Research Assessment in 2019. So DORA is not just a commitment to rethink what metrics we use to evaluate research excellence, but it's also a commitment to rethink what research outputs we value, including treating data as an important research output that can be a major scientific contribution in its own right. And so the agencies are taking steps towards implementing responsible research assessment in line with recommendations in DORA. And an excellent example of this is the new Research Excellence Framework that was recently adopted by CIHR. And it includes, as you can see on the slide here, key components such as open science and scientific rigor, and both of which are principles that obviously underpin good research data management. So with that in mind, the tri-agencies expressed a vision for research data management around 2017, looking to have research data management accepted as a key component of research excellence, researchers equipped and ready to engage in international research collaboration where RDM requirements are standard practice, and Canadian research institutions ready to support RDM. And in order to achieve this, the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy has 3 requirements, which you're probably familiar with, having seen me presented this slide at different conferences. Matthew Lucas is also well known for having shown this many times. The one requirement that we're going to focus on today is the first one, obviously, institutional strategies. And this requirement was that each post-secondary institution and research hospital eligible to administer agency funding was required to create an institutional research data management strategy, to notify the agencies when it had been completed, and to post it publicly. And it's important to note here that the agencies were not prescriptive about the content or the format of these strategies, with the understanding that research data management practices vary among institutions for various reasons. So rather, the requirement was intended to provide a snapshot of national RDM capacity and identify RDM capabilities and gaps, to encourage alignment and collaboration, and also to allow tailoring to specific contexts and needs. The deadline for institutions to submit their strategies was March 2023, and out of the 251 institutions that were subject to this requirement, 225 have submitted strategies, including 6 from institutions that weren't subject to the requirement. So we're looking at a pretty high rate of compliance. We're talking about 87%. And the agencies are working with the institutions that haven't yet produced their strategies to help them complete that. And so Earlier this year, SSHRC commissioned a study by the Meta Research and Open Science team at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, also in collaboration with the Alliance. And today, that's where we're going to hear about. Chantal is going to tell us about these results. I also quickly wanted to announce that there is a preprint anticipated in the coming weeks. I just received the translation, the French translation of the report about an hour before this webinar, so I'm happy to say that it should be made public in the coming weeks. And with that, I'll leave it to Chantal to tell you about the study itself.
Thank you. Yes, so I'll be presenting the results from the cross-sectional mapping. I did want to highlight that this was done in concert with various partners, as we already mentioned. The project lead was Dr. Kelly Covey at the Ottawa Heart Institute under her Meta Research and Open Science program. So as Dom already provided the context, we were looking to understand the capabilities and the gaps that were presented in these institutional strategies. At the time of this study, we had actually amassed only 211 strategies that were published back in February 2024. The intention was not to actually evaluate them. This was not considered an audit, but again, to kind of surface those gaps and readiness by the institutions to support RDM. How the project team went about doing this, we constructed a data extraction form to support this cross-sectional mapping. It featured both quantitative and qualitative elements. Multiple people came together to design this data extraction form, and it was iterated in pilot on a sample of the strategies. We even consulted with members at FNIGC and others to kind of ensure that all elements of interest were reflected in that data extraction form. We had a team of coders within the Meta Research program at the Ottawa Heart Institute, as well as members from the Research Excellent Interest Group REAG members that participate in extraction of these strategies. The robustness included a primary extractor as well as a quality control. The qualitative elements were thematically analyzed by two independent coders in order to reach consensus on some of the themes. So as I mentioned, and dominously referenced as well, 6 institutions in our sample were not actually subject to the requirements. And when we did the analysis, there were only 211 strategies. So now I'm going to present some of the characteristics that surface. So primarily of the institutional strategies that we examined, the majority of them were from universities, about 39% of them, as well as colleges and cégeps. We decided to look at cégeps independent of colleges within the strategies themselves. Most strategies actually articulated or referenced in the strategies themselves, a wide composition of stakeholders on campus that came together to develop these strategies, including ethics office, members from the library and the research office. Less frequently, these team compositions featured members from legal services, student bodies and associations, or representatives from Indigenous bodies or members. And what I mean by that is Indigenous researchers or Indigenous organizational representatives. But we did see clear mobilization to come together and have a conversation on these campuses. Several key findings I'd like to highlight now. We looked at what assessment models and framework institutions use to benchmark themselves, as well as facilitate RDM services in planning. We found that the Alliance Institutional RDM Strategy template that was shared to support strategy development was moderately used by institutions, most notably by universities at about 24% of these strategies, colleges about 15%, and less among other types of institutions like hospitals. Institutions also employed other models, including the RDM Maturity Assessment Model in Canada, which was produced by the working group of the Alliance, as well as international models such as the Research Infrastructure Self-Evaluation Framework, more commonly referred to as the RISE framework, from the Digital Curation Center. We also looked at whether or not institutions consulted their research communities in developing their strategies, recognizing that the critical input of these researchers will be imperative. And we found that only about a third of institutions reported undertaking some form of formal consultation as part of their strategy development. Most often, we found a reliance on surveys to inform institutional strategies. What we found at the end is that when taken into consideration, many institutional strategies did articulate the need for more consultation and engagement with their communities as they work towards implementation. We also looked at what we framed as needs, looking at resources and capacity challenges that were to have surfaced in the strategies themselves. Institutional strategies identified the need for financial and human resources to implement their strategies effectively. So we did find that there is a variability of resources and capacity across institutions, and this will highlight the need for tailored support and funding mechanisms moving forward. Strategic planning pertaining to infrastructure considerations, development of RDM expertise, and RDM training will be essential to coordinate amongst institutions as well as national partners such as the Alliance in order to meet some of these demands. We also found that there was an increased reliance on developing RDM-specific policies at institutions, working with their information technology services to create robust solutions, as well as training. So that was one of the main emphases as well, was onboarding and training researchers in best practices around research data management. We took a greater dive into support for data management plans, as this is one of the agency requirements in their Tri-Agency Policy. And there was a near universal reference to DMPs in these institutional strategies at about 92% of them, which really emphasized the effort placed on planning for data management. However, we found that only 43% of strategies reference the National Data Management Assistant tool that's made available by the Alliance. I do want to put a caveat here. We looked at whether there was specific reference to these tools. So this is not to say that institutions aren't aware of it, but if it did not surface within the strategies, we did not count that. Providing robust support for DMP creation and implementation will be essential to maximize these values of DMPs. Many institutions did raise the concern for having the capacity to provide consultation and more in-depth support. Colleges and CEGEPs were more likely to have identified in their strategies, relying on directing researchers to external training resources and templates to support the development of these DMPs. We also wanted to understand how institutions were preparing and ready for the data deposit requirements that have not yet come into effect. Most institutions, about 91% now, did address data deposit as part of their strategies. However, less than 80% provided any insight around the support provisions to their researchers. Many strategies reference the National Repository of Solutions, Borealis, and the Federated Research Data Repository that exist. But while we did not explicitly look at this in our data extraction form, it did surface through the thematic analysis that several strategies identified the lack of functionality that supports sensitive data deposit. So that did surface as a gap and a concern among many institutions about being able to support researchers in sharing and depositing sensitive data. Several strategies did make reference to the Digital Research Alliance Controlled Access Management Initiative, which I understand is a pilot to support the deposit of sensitive data. So these are certain considerations in terms of national infrastructure that will need to be explored and understood further as the tri-agencies roll out their data deposit requirements. The Tri-Agency RDM Policy recommended in the policy statement itself that data created in the context of research by and with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, collectives, and organizations be managed in according to principles developed and approved by those communities, collectives, and organizations. So we sought to map whether and how Indigenous data was addressed in the institutional strategies. Again, just to see the coverage. Oops, pardon me. I didn't mean to scroll too far away there. And what we found was that about 70% of strategies included considerations for Indigenous data management, which aligns with the Tri-Agency Policy. However, we found that the depth and detail of these how detailed they went into them was very minimal, which points to the need for further consultations and building partnerships with our Indigenous communities as we consider implementation. We also recognize that culture and behavior change will be an important factor as we shift towards high-quality research data management practices in Canada. So we examined as well within these strategies whether institutional RDM acknowledged the need for change and what came out through thematic analysis. There was actually very limited discussion. So most often strategies identified for strengthening the governance at their institutions to provide clearer direction, policies, and strategies. Only one institution actually linked their strategy to their signing of the Declaration of Research Assessment, so DORA. Very few actually even identify the need for incentives or further rewards. So acknowledging that greater emphasis will need to be considered on able to shift this culture towards robust RDM practices in Canada. And we know that monitoring policy and governance performance will be essential to ensure proper implementation of these strategies. And we recognize that there are potentially opportunities to investigate DMP, like the amount of DMPs created, or our data deposit requirements being adhered to. But these are on the researcher level. There wasn't very many clear mechanisms that surfaced on how institutions will be assessed to understand how they evolve in their efforts to support RDM. We looked at, through our thematic analysis, did institutions identify how and on what time horizons they would be evaluating their strategies? Will they be maintaining them? And while many of them did identify some form of monitoring, not many of them had a specific timeline or method for their assessment. So less than 25% of those. Most strategies actually refer to themselves as a live-in document and updated as needed. If you think about it, I think the timeline for these to have been published was a couple of years ago already, and we have not found evidence of any annual reporting progresses towards these. So other members within the national landscape would probably want to consider how to assess changes at the institutional capacity on supporting RDM. And so those are some of the findings that we had, which we can elaborate further in the preprint that will be forthcoming and that will be then published. Again, this is descriptive in nature. Our mapping does not necessarily capture anything beyond those explicitly stated in the strategies. So elements like the reference to the DMP, or if they did consultations or not, were only reflective if they were in the strategy. And as Dom alluded to, there was a non-prescriptive instruction on how to create strategies by the tri-agencies. This led to a huge variation in the types of documents that were produced. So in our cross-sectional mapping, we analyze specific RDM policies, plans to create strategies, comprehensive strategies with implementation plans. So there was a very diverse type of documents that were created to conform with this policy requirement. So as part of our analysis, horizontal comparison across institutions should be limited or considered in light of these differences. Some of the key takeaways that surfaced for us within the meta research program is that the tri-agency requirement for institutions to create strategies was taken seriously, as we saw by the team composition and the amount of stakeholders that came together to mobilize. The strategies themselves have helped surface local as well as national gaps for where resources could be strategically better aligned. The need for coordination and implementation of strategies, particularly when it comes to sensitive data deposit, for instance, has surfaced as a potential need. And while as a greater emphasis towards recognizing a shift in incentives and rewards across actors in the ecosystem will be critical to help mobilize and strengthen a culture shift towards robust RDM. As I mentioned, this project was done in concert with various stakeholders, not only at the meta research team, but as well as partners with the agencies, the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and FNIGC members as well. So we thank them for their input. I'd like to pass the speaking role now off to Alex. Thank you.
So a subgroup of the main research group, which is consisted of myself, Dylan Dearborn, Michael Steelworthy, and the REG members, Ming Lu Wang, Lucia Costanza, and Elizabeth Larity. We all decided to look at the headings and definitions that were included in the strategies. Before I go any further, I'd like to remind everyone, sort of repeating what Chantal just said, the tri-agencies did not provide structural guidance about the content or organization of the documents in order to allow institutions to reflect on their own circumstances. So given the variety of institution types, sizes, and regional characteristics, a one-size-all approach would not work in what we're looking at. as each institution's strategy was uniquely structured, meaning direct comparisons are not possible, and it's difficult to determine if patterns exist. So we're basically doing our best, but everything was different. So first off, with the headings, we wanted to look at the headings that we use to structure the documents to see if there is anything interesting that we can learn from the institutional approaches to organizing the strategies. Note that when analyzing the headings, we are only looking at the headings themselves and not the context provided by the content underneath, as the content analysis was already done with the previous work that Chantal just spoke about. Some of the preliminary general observations that we have noted so far are that of the 211 institutions, all of the institutions had at least one level of heading in their document. About 90% had a second level of heading or a subheading. In contrast to the colleges, though, where only about 68% had a second level heading, and 55 strategies, which is about a quarter, had a third level heading or a subheading. On average, there are 13 headings included in the strategies when we looked at the number of the first and second level headings. So that's the headings and subheading levels. We're continuing to look at the structure of the strategies to see if there's further insight we can gain. For example, we are coding the headings by topic areas to understand what may have been typically included or used to organize the flow of strategies. We're also going to look at the structural similarities between strategies to understand common and shared approaches. We were curious to see if the structures reflected the guidance provided by the tri-agencies in the RDM policy. Specifically, these were the expectations on researchers around data management plans, data deposit, and the need to recognize Indigenous research in the strategy. So we did a quick count of how many strategies use these terms in their headings. This could have just been the concept as a heading, but we also accounted for headings that included terms as part of the heading. Again, this does not mean these topics were not addressed if there was no heading, just if they were included as a heading. And you can see some differences by institution type. Consider the appearance of data management planning as heading in the strategies. 42 of 82 universities, about 50%, use the term as a heading, whereas only 18 of the 66 colleges, about a quarter, use them as a heading. Now compare the appearances for Indigenous. For example, the heading Indigenous Data Sovereignty. 34 of the 82 universities, about 40%, included the term in their headings, whereas 60% of the colleges included it in their headings. Now, remember, the appearance or exclusion of these terms as a heading is not an indicator of whether or not data management planning or Indigenous data sovereignty were addressed in the strategies. Rather, it's whether the structure of the strategies reflect the guidance from the Tri-Agency RDM policy. Now, onto the definitions that were included in the strategies. Here we want to see what terms were being defined, if there's any commonalities between the terms and definitions included, and if a citation or reference was included, and where that reference was from. So first, there were over 200 different terms across all of these strategies, both in English and French. We did include any acronyms that were provided in strategies that were defined as a definition. This is the list of the top 24 terms that we found throughout the English and French strategies, and we identified in the language column which were defined, which terms were included in just the English strategies, just the French strategies, or appeared in both English and French. We then took a look at these terms and organized them into different themes to get a better idea of what was being defined. And this is the table that is showing the 15 themes that we came up with examples of the terms in each of these themes. And then finally, we wanted to look at where the institutions were pulling the definitions from. Not all strategies included citations or references to the definitions, but for those that did, we also organized these into themes or categories to better examine them. This chart is showing how many times a source, grouped by the category, was referenced in either a French or English strategy. The end value at the end of the bar is the total number of times that a category was referenced. For example, national sites, in the national sites would include references to things like the Tri-Agency RDM Policy FAQ page or the CIHR glossary page. Overall, all the sites categorized within national sites were cited as the source 258 times between the French and English strategies. However, the sources of the definitions may not be the best way to identify areas of priority outlined in the strategy, but may provide an estimation about the references institutions regularly access for information about RDM. And also point out the very last item in the chart, multiple references. This refers to where a term was had more than one reference provided. For example, they may have the term like RDM, and it was referenced from both the Tri-Agency and the Alliance web pages. So finally, what are our next steps? So REG is going to continue doing a bit more of a dive into the results of this research. And so we want to look at where institutions were pulling the definitions from. Not all strategies included citations or references to the definitions, but for those that did, we also, oh, sorry, I forgot to scroll down. So we're going to look further into the definitions and headings. We're interested in commonalities and where the differences existed. For the headings, we want to see if there's any further insight we can gain into the structure of the strategies and try to understand if there's any common or shared approaches to writing the strategies. And then with the definitions, we'll be looking at the actual definitions provided and see if there's any commonalities between the definitions and the sources that were provided, if any. REG will also be conducting a second RDM capacity survey in 2025. We ran the first one in 2019. And we're going to use some of the findings from this research and some of the findings that Chantal mentioned to help us inform questions in the new version of the survey. So that's the next thing we'll be doing. And that is everything we have for about headings and definitions so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers regarding the results of the mapping, and hopefully it's provided some food for thoughts as institutions move towards policies and roadmaps to implementation. So thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy your Tuesday.